Most people think they know what a serial killer looks like, but history has a way of proving us wrong, especially when the killers in question were women hiding in plain sight. But these aren't the famous names you've heard hundreds of times before. These are the ones who slipped under the radar, and that's because they were posing as sweet, innocent, and even helpful, you could say. Let's dive into 5 female serial killers from Europe and the chilling crimes most people have not heard of. Starting with a woman who exploited serious gaps in the childcare and foster regulations in the most gruesome way. Dagmar Overbye. If you were living in Copenhagen around 1916, you probably wouldn't have noticed Dagmar Overbye. She wasn't someone who drew attention. She wasn't dramatic or loud or the sort of person who made others uneasy. In fact, she seemed quite the opposite. Calm, ordinary, and helpful. And for the mothers who came to her door desperate for someone to take in their newborns, she must have seemed like a savior. But behind the closed doors of her apartment, Overbye was hiding a reality that Denmark would later struggle to even talk about. Dagmar Overbye was born in 1887 and grew up in a working-class environment where daily life wasn't really easy. There's nothing really in her early years that stands out in the historical record, nothing dramatic or unusual. She had jobs, relationships, and even at one point a child of her own who died in infancy. Now at the time, this wasn't unusual. Infant mortality across Europe was high, and so her baby's death didn't really trigger any suspicions. By the time she reached her late 20s, she had started taking in children, mostly babies, from mothers who needed someone to look after them. The arrangement was really simple. A mother would show up, often alone or overwhelmed, and Overbye would offer to foster the child or find a family for them who could. At the time, Denmark did have laws for fostering, but the enforcement was really inconsistent, and so many women wanted privacy. And so Overbye presented herself as someone who could really help them, quietly. But instead of helping, she was doing quite the opposite, which would ultimately give her the nickname of the Angel Maker. Between 1916 and 1920, Overbye accepted babies into her care, but then she would go on to murder many of them just shortly after she received them. Investigators later determined that she used methods like strangulation, drowning, and suffocation. She even disposed of the bodies in ways she believed would prevent discovery, like for example burning the remains in her stove. For years, no one really noticed. Many mothers never returned, believing their child was placed in another family somewhere in Denmark, but that would soon change. In 1920, one mother who had placed her baby with Overbye, she later changed her mind and went back to retrieve the baby. Now, Overbye told her that the child had already been sent to another family, but when the mother pushed for details, like names, addresses, anything, Overbye couldn't really give her straight answers. And it was her contradictions that made the woman suspicious enough so that she went on over to contact the police. And this single moment cracked open 4 years' worth of hidden crimes. Authorities searched Overbye's home and found what the mother feared the most: remains of infants in the stove and other physical evidence confirming that multiple children had indeed died in there too. Now, once Overbye was arrested, investigators tried to map out exactly how many babies had been placed with her and how many had disappeared. Now, the final numbers will never be known for certain, but it could be up to 25. In 1921, Overbye went on trial, and it instantly gripped Denmark. Newspapers' headlines were stark, and people across the country followed every development. The case even revived debates about the death penalty, which had recently been abolished. Now, inside the courtroom, Overbye didn't create dramatic scenes or emotional outbursts. She admitted to some of the killings, but not to them all. Medical experts explained the cause of death in the proven cases, and mothers testified about the arrangements they had made with her. The investigators even described how consistently children vanished after she received them. And so finally, in December of 1921, Dagmar Overbye was convicted of murdering 9 infants. She was sentenced to life in prison, the harshest punishment available in Denmark at the time. And the sentence was controversial not because people doubted her guilt, but because life imprisonment for a woman was rare. Overbye died in prison just 8 years later in 1929, but her case didn't fade quietly. It directly influenced Denmark's approach to children care and foster regulations, New laws were introduced, and oversight was strengthened, to close the gaps that had allowed Overbye to operate without scrutiny for such a long time. Now, our next case will surely turn your stomach and might even make you question what you eat from your neighbors, if you ever do. Leonarda Cianciulli. When people talk about famous Italian criminals, the conversation usually jumps straight to mobsters, bandits, or political assassins. Hardly anyone ever mentions a middle-aged woman from a small Emilia-Romagna town who ran a soap shop and treated her neighbors with warm familiarity. Yet Leonarda Cianciulli, born in 1894, became one of Italy's most unsettling killers. And not because of her high body counts or dramatic chases, but because of what she did with the bodies afterwards. Leonarda's early life was not an easy one. She grew up in southern Italy in a difficult family environment marked by poverty and instability. As a young woman, she tried taking her life twice. And then in 1917, she finally married, but the marriage reportedly caused tension with her mother. Leonarda and her husband eventually had to move multiple times because of the economic hardship and earthquake damage in the region. But that all changed in 1930. Then, they settled in a small town of Correggio, and it was there where Leonarda finally seemed to be able to build a stable life. She ran a small shop selling soaps and homemade goods, and she became known among locals as this ordinary, hard-working woman. She had several children, but because of many died in infancy, the surviving ones, especially her oldest son Giuseppe, became the center of her daily life. Throughout the 1930s, Italy was under fascist rule, and by the end of the decade, the country was preparing for war. And when Italy entered World War II in 1940, Giuseppe planned to enlist in the army. But this made Leonarda deeply anxious about losing him, and so she went on to hatch a plan that would write her name down the history of morbid facts. In 1939, Leonarda began preparing these solutions to allegedly protect her son. But these plans would cost 3 local women their lives. The victims were acquaintances who trusted Leonarda, which made the crimes particularly shocking to the people of Correggio once the truth came out. Her first victim was a middle-aged woman named Faustina Setti. Setti believed Leonarda was actually helping her find a suitable husband in another town. And so Leonarda instructed Setti to write these letters to relatives saying that she was leaving voluntarily for this supposed marriage. But on the day that Setti was supposed to depart, Leonarda invited her to her home, and there Leonarda struck Setti and then dismembered her body. The second victim, Francesca Soavi, was a schoolteacher. And so Leonarda told Soavi that she had secured a job for her far away from Correggio, again instructing her to write all these letters, insisting that she was leaving on her own choice. And then, when Soavi visited the house to finalize the details, Leonarda murdered her in the same way. The third and final victim was Virginia Cacioppo, a former opera singer. Leonarda told her that she had arranged a position for her in Florence, and again she guided her to prepare all these letters explaining her departure. And in September 1940, when Cacioppo visited her house, Leonarda went on to do what she had done to the other 2 women as well. For a while, no one really suspected Leonarda. The letters allowed families to believe that the woman had indeed left town voluntarily, and Leonarda continued her daily life as if nothing had changed. What finally exposed her was the disappearance of Cacioppo. You see, her relatives were more persistent and skeptical. Her sister-in-law even became suspicious and went to the police. And because Leonarda had been the last person to see Virginia alive, the authorities had to search her home. And what they would find in there changed everything everyone thought they knew about Leonarda. It would actually turn out that the murders were not the worst part of Leonarda's crimes. The detail that made Leonarda internationally infamous came from her own testimony and those police findings. And here's what actually happened. After killing each woman, Leonarda had to find a way to dispose of the bodies. And so, she turned some of the remains into substances used for soap, and the rest she turned into baked goods that she would then feed to her son and the whole village that would come in and buy them from her. This would even give her the nickname, the soap maker of Correggio. But she didn't stop there. She would bathe her own son with all of these soaps and give him all those pies she had made, because she actually believed that all of this would make him stronger and keep him away from any harm. The worst thing is that when the investigators examined her house, they found clear evidence in support of all of this, and so there was no doubt that Leonarda was actually telling the truth. And once confronted with the evidence, Leonarda confessed to everything and didn't deny any part of her involvement. Her trial then began in 1946, and it quickly became one of Italy's most discussed post-war court cases. Journalists described her demeanor as calm and matter-of-fact, and the official court transcripts confirmed that she explained her methods without hesitation. Leonarda was ultimately convicted of the murder of Seti, Soavi, and Cacioppo, and she received a sentence of 30 years in prison and an additional 3 years in criminal asylum, which at the time was actually a really big deal because the Italian law only added asylum confinement for cases they considered severe and extreme, which, let's face it, Leonarda's was. And ultimately, that is where Leonarda died in 1970 in the asylum of Pozzuoli. But next, we have a woman who kept a very morbid collection down in her basement. Vera Renczi. If you flip through early 20th century crime records from Eastern Europe, you'll eventually stumble across a name that doesn't appear in many history books, but refuses to be forgotten once you've heard it. Vera Renczi. Born sometimes in the late 19th century, she lived in what is now known as Romania. And the story stands out not just because of the allegations against her, but also because of how much of the case was documented by police, courts, and also newspapers. What makes Vera Renczi so unsettling is not the image of a violent, chaotic criminal. Instead, she appeared elegant, composed, and even glamorous by the standards of her era. She came from a wealthy family in Bucharest, and after her father died, she and her mother then moved to the town of Berkerecul, which is the present day of Serbian Zrenjanin. Her upbringing included private tutors, good schools, and the sort of refined education that was only usually reserved for the upper-class girls at the time. So by all accounts, she lived comfortably. She then married young and soon had a son. Her first husband, however, disappeared after a surprisingly short amount of time. Newspapers later reported that she claimed that he had abandoned her, and so because no one really questioned her explanation at the time, she just continued living on quietly with her child. She would then go on to remarry, but her second husband also disappeared. And once again, she told friends and her neighbors that he had left her for another woman, and in an era where marital abandonment wasn't entirely rare, her account didn't really raise any immediate alarms. But the disappearances didn't stop. Renczi eventually took a number of lovers, men who came and went, drawn in by her beauty and charm. Some stayed days, some weeks, some even longer, but almost all of them vanished. Relatives sometimes tried tracking these men down, some even went to the police, but each time their trails seemed to end at Renczi's door. Now, she did offer explanations, apparently the man had left her, the relationships had ended, and they just moved on. And without evidence to the contrary, and with no advanced forensics investigations common at the time, authorities didn't really push any of this further. But that would soon change. The wife of one of Vera's lovers refused to accept her story, and she had a very good reason for it. Because it would turn out that she knew about the fact that her husband was going to visit Vera. He had told her as much. And so, when he never returned home, the woman went to the police, pressing them to take her seriously. After enough persistence and after similar complaints began to surface, the police opened a formal investigation. And it's exactly here where the story takes a very dark turn. When officers arrived at Renczi's property, they finally discovered the detail that made this case infamous for decades. In her cellar, they found dozens of zinc coffins, and each of them contained the remains of a man. In fact, there were as many as 35 bodies, and the men matched individuals who had disappeared after knowing Vera. Authorities did arrest Renczi and began questioning her intensely. She ended up admitting to poisoning multiple men with arsenic, and apparently Vera served them meals and drinks with the poison in them, and then she kept their bodies in the zinc coffins in her basement. And the motive was very simple: jealousy and the fear of abandonment. But then another shock came. Police confirmed that her son, who had also disappeared many years earlier, was among the dead too. So not only did Vera poison her husbands and lovers, but she went on to do the same to her own child. But here's where Vera provided another morbid fact. She kept visiting the coffins almost daily, to spend time with those men well after they passed. And so for her crimes, she started to be called the Black Widow. Her trial in the early 1920s drew enormous regional attention. Newspapers through the Balkans covered the proceedings because her case was really unheard of. Ultimately, Vera was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and she served her sentence in women's prisons in Yugoslavia, dying in custody sometimes in the early 1930s. Now, while Vera fully confessed, we cannot really say the same about the next woman, even though her crimes and evidence would shake the whole country. Marianne Nölle. When the case of Marianne Nölle finally reached the German courts in the late 1990s, most people were really shocked to discover that one of the country's deadliest serial killers had been hiding in plain sight for years. She was wearing a nurse uniform, moving calmly between hospital beds, and blending into the daily routines of a busy medical ward. But she wasn't a mysterious outsider or a violent intruder. She was part of the system, trusted with access to vulnerable patients who depended on her for their care. Nölle was born in 1938 in Cologne, and by the time she reached her adulthood, she had settled into what seemed like a very ordinary life. She trained as a nurse and eventually built a long-term career in that field, working with patients who were elderly, chronically ill, or recovering from serious conditions. Nothing in her early life is recorded as unusual or dramatic. She simply became one of many nurses staffing the wards of German care facilities during the late 20th century. The hospital where she spent much of her career, Städtische Klinik in Kolmernheim, was busy, like most major medical centers. Patients went in and out, deaths happened regularly, and that predictable, almost routine background of illness and mortality created the perfect cover. The crimes that later emerged were tied to clobazam, a benzodiazepine medication used for treating anxiety and seizures. Now, when given in normal doses under medical supervision, clobazam is safe. But in higher amounts that were found in several of Nölle's patients, it could be lethal, especially for elderly or frail individuals. Her case started to draw more attention in the 80s. You see, between 1984 and 1992, unexplained deaths began occurring in the wards where Nölle worked. Patients who had previously been stable suddenly deteriorated. Some slipped into unconsciousness and would never wake up. But doctors thought those were because of cardiac arrests or respiratory failures, diagnoses that didn't really raise any alarms at the time, especially considering who those patients were. And it wouldn't be until the late 1990s when hospitals' administrators and medical examiners noticed the pattern. Certain deaths seemed clustered around specific shifts. Certain symptoms appeared repeatedly. And certain medication levels in the deceased patients didn't really make any sense when compared to their prescriptions. So naturally, the hospital alerted the police, who then launched a detailed investigation. Autopsies were ordered, medical charts were re-examined, toxicologists began analyzing tissue samples, and the results? They were difficult to ignore. Several patients had dangerously elevated levels of clobazam in their bodies, levels far beyond what had been prescribed, and levels they couldn't really receive accidentally. Investigators compare patients' histories, nursing assignments, medication logs, and also shift records. And that's exactly when the same name began to appear: Marianne Nölle. Police arrested her in 1993, and over the next few years, a massive forensic review took place. Medical experts re-examined dozens of deaths. Prosecutors eventually charged Nölle with 7 murders and 9 attempted murders, though it is suspected that she might have been responsible for up to 17 confirmed deaths and as many as 40 possible victims. During her 1999 trial in Cologne, Nölle maintained her innocence. She never confessed to anything. She did not offer explanations. She simply denied all the accusations, even while medical experts presented clear evidence, which then the court would describe as very overwhelming. And so, in 1999, Marianne Nölle was convicted of 7 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, and due to the severity of her crimes, the court also added a special clause that would make sure that she stayed behind the bars until the rest of her life. And she did die in there in 2022 when she was 84. Our last case is about a woman who pretended to help the old and the vulnerable, but in fact she had her own dark plans in the making. Elfriede Blauensteiner. If you think that serial killers are always dramatic, loud, or part of some twisted duo, the case of Elfriede Blauensteiner proves that you don't always hear footsteps before evil walks in. She used a cloak of normalcy, compassion, and elderly care work to conceal the terror she was committing in Vienna. Elfriede was born on December 31st, 1931 in Austria, and by 1980s she was living and working in Vienna, often describing herself as a social worker or care assistant. And so on the surface, she seemed like really someone people could trust. She would visit the older, vulnerable people, offer them help, and claim that she was there to support them. And that access would become her greatest weapon, earning her the nickname the Black Widow, which coincidentally is the second one we have on the list today, but that's for a very different reason. Between the late 1980s and early 1990s, several elderly people in Vienna died under very suspicious circumstances after being cared by or having dealings with Elfriede. Now, the victims were mostly elderly women, often living alone, and thus socially vulnerable. Because of their age, illnesses, and general fragility, their deaths initially attracted very little public notice. The investigators began to detect a pattern. In multiple cases, there was a woman connected to the victim and showing interest in inheritance, money management, or caregiving. And that woman was the same, Elfriede. Then, after their death, or acting on their behalf when they were not able to do that themselves, she would appear to manage their financial affairs. And it's precisely that shift that sparked enough suspicion that authorities began to look into more closely. Forensics re-examinations reveal traces of poison in some of the bodies, far more that would be normal for the end-of-life medications or diseases. And the link between victims, circumstances of their deaths, and Elfriede's involvement was strong enough for prosecutors to build a case. As suspicions grew in the mid-1990s, law enforcement in Vienna opened a formal investigation. They cross-checked death certificates, medical records, estate documents, and bank transactions. They also interviewed surviving relatives, neighbors, and people who had known the victims. And so by 1997, the prosecutors were finally able to charge Elfriede with multiple counts of murder. The trial drew public attention in Austria because it exposed just how deeply someone could hide beneath kindness and how vulnerable victims of age and isolation could be. In 1998, Blauensteiner was convicted for the murder of at least 3 victims. The ones with the strongest evidence like toxicology, last known contact, financial benefit, and witness testimonies. The court also recognized that she was suspected in several more deaths, though evidence there was less solid. And so in total, she was most likely responsible for killing at least 10 people. Even though there was only solid proof for 3 of those murders, her sentence still resulted in life imprisonment. Elfriede served her sentence under maximum security conditions, and she died in prison in 2003 at the age of 72. And while her death closed the legal chapter, more questions remained. Now, while there are definitely fewer female serial killers than males, we can still only imagine how many have never been caught, since they often pose as innocent, helpful individuals. I do have 5 more names in the making, but in the meantime, if you want to see more on this topic, then watch this video next. Until next time.